Welcome to the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. And if you're enjoying this podcast, do us a favor and click the subscribe button and the like button, and that'll help us a lot. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Ayer, the T. Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Well, a very blessed Holy Week to you, Carlos.
Same to you, Alberto. It's a very special week. There's nothing else like it. And I guess what you experienced during your childhood, stays with you through life. But Holy Week, when I was a child in Cuba, was in fact like no other week of the year. So I think adjusting to the fact that in other countries it's just not as intense, still, at my age, startles me.
Well, I can say that as I've gotten older, Holy Week has become even more and more incredible.
Yeah, there's nothing else like it, and that's the power of tradition.
Absolutely. Over our past episodes, we've talked about a lot of different mystics and the phenomena that they were able to carry out, that they experienced, the mystical experiences. But on a few of them, they also suffered persecution. So we thought it would be a good idea to do an episode on the persecution that mystics have suffered over the centuries. So
Yes.
Why don't you lead us into that, Carlos?
Yeah, and Holy Week is especially apt time for this, because most simple fact about mystics is they can be seen as troublemakers. Imagine the difference in authority between anyone who holds a position of religious authority and someone who comes along and says, well, I've had these experiences of the divine. And I am reminded of passages in John's Gospel which are really, really astounding descriptions of the way in which Jesus was viewed as a troublemaker by those around him, especially by the religious authorities, and especially the point at which he's talking to the leaders of the Jewish community in Jerusalem and brings up Abraham. And they ask him, you're not 50 years old yet you're speaking of having had some kind of personal knowledge about Abraham. Because he says, Abraham longed to see this day, and now it is here. And they ask him, you're just a young pup. You're not even 50 years old, and you say you've known Abraham. And he says, before Abraham was, I am. And oh boy, that's a turning point in John's Gospel where it's just interpreted by the religious leaders in Jerusalem as the ultimate blasphemy. He has said that he is God. And oh boy, nothing can be done after that point. It's the point of no return in the Gospel of John, after which every step after that goes to the Passion. Now, none of the mystics that we've talked about or deal with, none of these human beings are divine, but they do claim a very special closeness to the divine, and they pose the same challenge to religious authorities as the challenge posed by Jesus, saying, before Abraham was, I am. So there are many scholars of mysticism who have argued that mysticism is inherently challenging to authority, that it's a form of dissent, that in fact it's a way that someone can claim they can circumvent the whole authority structure of any church. And while that's true, it is also true that most of the mystics that you and I have talked about have not actually, although they pose threats, they have not challenged authority in a very overt way. And as a matter of fact, most Christian mystics, or mystics in the Christian tradition, they have upheld tradition rather than chucked it out the window and replaced it with something totally different. Although there are some of those. They're spectacular sometimes. The fact remains that mysticism is inherently problematic for anyone in a position of authority in an organized church. And it doesn't matter which church we're talking about, any organized church, anyone who comes along and says, I've had this closeness with God, or I'm having this closeness with God, poses a problem for the clergy who are there every day doing their thing, but they can't make the same claim. My dissertation advisor, Stephen Osment, actually wrote a book, and we'll get to this eventually today, Mysticism and Dissent, which was about the Protestant reformers who were mystics and posed a challenge to the Protestant reformers who were not mystics. And he often used to say in his lectures about mysticism, how are you going to keep the people in the church after they have seen God? So who's going to put up with all the stuff that goes on in any church if they've had a mystical experience? And his assumption was that anyone who had a mystical experience would, of course, feel constrained, right? Or perhaps disappointed by any organized church. And there's some truth to that, but it's only some. In fact, most of the well-known mystics have not, let's say, upset the cart, but rather made the cart move much more smoothly, but not without experiencing some difficulties. And that's what we're talking about today, the difficulties that mystics face. It's not possible for anyone who makes claims about access to divinity. It's just not possible to escape problems.
And I imagine during the Middle Ages, in the time of the Inquisition, such claims really brought a lot of attention on these mystics.
They could. And given the whole 2,000-year sweep of Christian history, one has to distinguish between the first millennium and the second millennium, the first 1,000 years. In early Christianity, there are a number of mystics, and Paul himself, his epistles, his letters are full of mystical language. And Paul is considered an apostle, even though he was not one of the original 12 apostles, precisely because of the fact that he encountered the divine while persecuting the early church, and then had his conversion experience. And from there on in, he was plugged in to the divine. But in the first millennium, the first 1,000 years, there are mystics like Augustine, for instance, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that the first 3 centuries, up until 313, there's persecution. After 313, there's the imperial church. But when the Western Roman Empire collapses, there's not that much writing going on. In the Eastern Church, there is, and there are mystics in the Eastern Christian tradition. But the fact is, we have not very many texts related to mystical experiences in the first 1,000 years, not compared to what happens in the second 1,000 years. So these mystics who encounter problems, most of them are from the second millennium. And actually, most of them are from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and especially 15th century. Because there's more writing. How can a mystic get in trouble is the basic question. Let's say they're a monk or a nun or a lay person. How are they going to get in trouble? Just locally in this time period, in the first millennium, and even into the 11th or 12th century. They're only going to get in trouble locally. It's when writings begin to circulate that a mystic can get into serious trouble as their writings become available to a much larger number of people. So when more writings begin to be circulated, manuscript, some individuals, like for instance, we're going to get into him immediately, Meister Eckhart, they get into trouble because They're widely known. They're not just locally known. And with the invention of printing in the middle of the 15th century, then with the printing press, more mystics expose themselves to being hauled in for what they're saying.
So let's talk a little bit about these mystics that were hauled in for, I imagine, heretical statements or heretical acts.
Well, yeah, we've talked about many of these mystics before, but not under this theme, right? And what is it that gets a mystic into trouble? How can you get into trouble? Well, you get into trouble by making your mysticism public. And we have to make distinctions because mystics will get into trouble in this period we're talking about. Let's say 1300 to the present. Mystics can get in trouble for different reasons. And I would like to distinguish three different kinds of mystics who get in trouble for different reasons. Although one of them gets in trouble in two categories. First, there are mystics suspected of heresy. And actually, some of them actually brought before tribunals to answer charges of heresy. And it's a pretty hefty list. And then, second category, we have mystics who are either processed by inquisitions, where there are inquisitions, or mystics who are disciplined by the church in some way, in places where there is no longer or there never has been an inquisition. And then there's a third category, which I alluded to previously, and that's, in Protestantism, mystics within the Protestant family tree who got into trouble because, of course, they didn't agree with the leaders of the Protestant Reformation. So 16th and 17th century, and even 18th century, Protestant mystics who upset the leaders of their local church. So there are many ways to get in trouble as a mystic, but there's no more a direct way to get in trouble than having your writings out in the public, being circulated. That's the most dangerous kind. We really don't know. We historians, we don't know exactly how many mystics might have gotten in trouble and suffered some kind of persecution or disciplining. We don't know, because probably there are thousands who, on a very small local level, were questioned about what they were saying or what they were claiming. And I should add, before we get to these three categories, that one of the most common situations that mystics find themselves in is having the genuineness of their experiences questioned. Because there are fakers, and there have always been fakers, and the fakers have to be sorted out from the real thing. So that's in the background always. Whenever a mystic makes claims and the claims are questioned, that's one of the chief questions. What are we dealing with here? Is this the genuine article or not? And much of what we will be talking about circles around this question. What is the genuine article? And how does one identify the genuine article? And in the first category, mystics suspected of heresy. It's a long list, but we can begin in the 14th century. Perfect example, Meister Eckhart, who had passages from some of his sermons condemned as heretical and had to defend himself. And he wrote a defense, item by item, of the charges made against him, but he never got to argue them in person because he died before he could stand before a tribunal. So we have his written defense, but the number of passages chosen by inquisitors as suspected of heresy is a large number. But given as he was to extreme statements, it's not surprising. So here are some of the passages from Meister Eckhart that got him into trouble. There is something in the soul which is uncreated and uncreatable. If the whole soul were such, it would be uncreated and uncreatable. And this is the intellect. Of course, this is an English translation of medieval German, but basically the statement implies that there's a divine nature in human beings. Uncreated can only mean one thing. You're not a creature. You have something that predates, even outside of time, predates creation. And he says this is the intellect. So blurring the line between creature and creator was the problem there. And similar statements were also brought up, such as, we are transformed entirely into God and changed into him. That's a very extreme statement. And of course, he's talking about the higher reaches of the mystical experience, past the, as he called it, the Durchbruch, or breakthrough, where he also speaks about the birth of the Son, capital S-O-N, in the English translation, the birth of the Son in the soul. So the birth of the second person of the Trinity in the soul as something that you can experience. Well, that's very extreme.
It is extreme when you think of Christianity in a very simple sense, where, God is eternal, uncreated, and he created us. But for me, when you think about the human creature that God created, there's something that humans have that no other creature possesses, and that is free will. And that free will, I would call it intellect. That same intellect that Meister Eckhart is referring to. And when you look at that, how else can humans have that and no other creature has free will? Every other creature below humans act out of instinct. They're hardwired. But humans are not.
No.
So that has to have some type of divine source that God gave us, like a little piece of, I don't want to get accused of heresy here either, but, a little piece of him that he implanted in us to be able to have that free will, because otherwise we're just an animal, which is really nothing more than a machine. It's programmed to act in a certain way, and they'll have different personalities and things of that nature. But when you poke a dog, it's going to bite you, and if you pull a cat's tail, it's going to scratch you. Where humans can constrain those
the instincts,
those instincts, because we have instincts as well. Humans can constrain that where animals cannot.
That's right.
So where does that come from? It obviously, it's a nature that God possesses that, perhaps, again, at the risk of sounding heretical, perhaps something that God gifted to us in order to have us be more, we were created in his image, so for us to be more like him.
Yes, and some scholars of religion would also point to consciousness. And actually that's a term that crosses over from the scholarly study of religion to the study of all religions. What is consciousness? What is human consciousness? And what does that mean? That we are conscious of our own existence and our own mortality and all these things that animals apparently are not conscious of. Also distinguishes us from animals. But Meister Eckhart loved extreme statements. He employed extreme statements in his sermons, and that's what got him into trouble. Statements such as, when the soul comes to its essence, it stands above time and space. Or in one of his sermons where he says, get beyond time. Get beyond time. Get to the eternal now moment, which you can experience. In God, there is no time. If you experience God, you're outside of time. You're in God's eternal now moment. So he also says, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. he answered in writing all of these charges of heresy concerning these very specific passages. He says, I've been misunderstood. He explains, this is not what I mean. Not exactly. But he didn't have a chance to do this in person. So as a result, suspicion lingered over his writings for centuries until just about the 19th century. And he's very fond of paradoxes, like that statement, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. That's an extremely paradoxical statement. In the end, he submitted to the judgment of the church. Charged with heresy. It's a very serious thing, especially for a Dominican friar, which he was. And the Dominicans were the one religious order most intensely involved with the Inquisition. So for a Dominican to be charged with heresy, it's doubly bad, right? So he was very controversial for saying things that were extreme statements of what he... Let me pause for a second. Nothing that he writes about these experiences is written first person. Like he's not saying, I have experienced this. Or he doesn't word it by saying that this is what has happened to him. He's just speaking generally of the mystical experience that is available to everyone. And that makes him even, I suppose, more challenging and more dangerous to people in authority. And then, beyond Meister Eckhart, someone else from the same century, from the 14th century, who actually did go to extremes and didn't even care to defend herself. And we had a podcast on her, Marguerite Porete, who spoke of the annihilation of the soul and pushed that issue of identity with the divine to the extreme, and was charged with heresy and was found to be guilty of heresy and burned in 1310. And she said things such as, the soul is no longer in herself, for she is lost in the will of God and has no will of her own. The soul that is in such a state no longer practices the virtues, for God works in her, and she no longer has any regard for virtue or vice. These are extremely dangerous things to say, to erase the distinction between the human and the divine. And more than that, to make the claim that such a perfected soul, such a divine soul, no longer has any regard for virtue or vice, that it's, beyond sinning, it's not capable of sinning. These are very extreme statements. And one of the more disturbing elements of her trial, which we have a transcript, is that she remained silent. She refused to defend herself. Pretty much like Jesus before Pilate, right? And before the Sanhedrin, stays silent when asked to explain. And in her case, it's because the annihilated soul is beyond this. And this was viewed as just way, way, way too extreme. And it gets even more potentially dangerous. She says things such as, the soul takes no account of the teachings of the church, for she is taught directly by God. And that's the key issue. That's the main issue. That if you're being taught directly by God, then the next thing you can say is, you don't need the church. You are the church. You are your own church, basically. So Marguerite Porete, I suppose you could call her a martyr to extreme mysticism, but she's an outlier. There aren't very many other mystical heretics like her who pressed the boundaries of blurring the distinction between the divine and the human as far as she did. And the fact is that although for centuries after 1310, it was known that, who she was and some of the dangerous things she said, but the text that she wrote was lost for centuries, not found again until the 19th century. The Mirror, Simple Souls. And when it finally was discovered, there was a period of time there, several decades, where the connection was not made between that text and Marguerite. And the text, The Mirror of Simple Souls, was actually published in Europe by a Catholic publishing house, which I think is one of the most humorous twists in the history of Christian mysticism.
Well, she may have not spoken at her trial, but I guess she did get the last word.
Yes, she did. And she's an extreme example. So I brought her up just after Eckhart because they're both in the same century. They both make extreme statements. Eckhart tried to defend himself, but Marguerite, her soul was annihilated. She just didn't care if people didn't understand what she was saying. So she's kind of like the most extreme example of a mystic who was persecuted because she ends up paying for her extreme statements with her life. But then there are other mystics who make extreme statements and don't receive much pushback from church authorities. And this is, again, a bit puzzling, but it is nonetheless true and undeniable. Someone like Julian of Norwich, and we have talked about her before, who had many extreme statements, yet was never formally charged with heresy that we know of, and was not put through any kind of punishment or disciplining for saying extreme things. Julian of Norwich, the other extreme statements have reference to sin, where she says that sin is behoovely, sin is necessary, and also sin is as nothing. Well, what does that mean? Sin is as nothing. And in the afterlife, we will view our sins, which are like scars, and we will see them as something honorable. But Julian of Norwich also pushed the boundaries of the concept of salvation. And of course, there's scholarly disagreement about what she means or what she intended to say, but some think that she was actually pushing for the concept of universal salvation, that all shall be saved eventually. When she says, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well, and all things shall be well. And that's her little secret revealed to her by God. But Julian was never hauled before any kind of, that we know of, any church court of any kind for making these extreme statements. And why? Well, she was a hermit, and her writings were not very widely circulated, and she wrote in English. Not English as we know it now, but an earlier form of English, which meant that her writings were not accessible to anyone outside of England. Because no one outside of England, or very, very, very few people, knew how to read English. But, and this is but with a capital B, there's no denying the fact that it's not until the late 19th and 20th century that her writings gained popularity. And let's say if anyone had written a history of Christian mysticism in the 18th century, she might have not been mentioned. So something similar happened with Meister Eckhart, whose writings, because they fell under suspicion, did not become more widely known until the 19th century. And then you have somebody like John of the Cross, 16th century, who got into trouble in various fronts, not just because of what he said or how he described his experiences, but because of what he was trying to do in the real world, which shows how complicated the life of a mystic can get. So this very central figure in Spanish mysticism, confessor to Saint Teresa of Avila, and suspected of not being quite orthodox because of what he had to say about prayer and about mystical experience, just like Saint Teresa. In addition to all this, tried to reform his order, the Carmelites, the male Carmelites. And his efforts to reform the order ended up getting him basically thrown into prison by members of his own order, his own brethren in Toledo. They cooped him up in a tiny cell that was so small that it was hard to stand up or even to lay flat, full length of your body. It was that small, and was physically abused, actually beaten repeatedly. For what? For wanting to return to a very strict observance of the Carmelite order. He eventually escaped, very much as any prisoner would escape from a prison, by climbing down from a window, the walls of Toledo, on sheets, down to the ground, escaping. And eventually, yes, he escaped, but his brethren didn't treat him very nicely from that point forward. He suffered a lot. He suffered a lot of humiliation. But I think that no one will dispute the fact that John of the Cross is one of the most difficult mystics to read and to comprehend. He is so detailed, but much of what he has to say in his treatises is very, very profound. And some of the things that he says are very similar, if not identical, to things that Meister Eckhart, Marguerite Porete, Julian of Norwich would have had to say, such as, and in Spanish from his treatise, The Spiritual Canticle, El alma se ha transformado en Dios y Dios en ella. The soul has been transformed into God and God into it. Is that any different from Eckhart's, the eye with which God's behold me is the eye with which I see him? No, it's not. It's not much different. It's just another way of saying the same thing. So he was never accused of heresy, but in 16th century Spain in his day, there was great fear, which the Inquisition kept a very close eye on mystics, a great fear of people like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and Francisco de Osuna, who were teaching a new way of praying, that was silent, wordless, which attempted to reach a state where actually you were not doing the praying, but God was doing the praying in you, through you. They were very suspicious of this, and there was actually, the Inquisition gave a very specific name to a heresy concerning this type of prayer, the alumbrados, the enlightened ones, who claimed that through this method of prayer they could achieve such a closeness with God that they were incapable of sinning. That was the charge made by the Inquisition. And there are many people charged with alumbradismo. John of the Cross, Ignatius Loyola, and Teresa of Avila. All three of these mystical giants of 16th century Spanish mysticism were suspected of and accused of heresy. And as I think we covered when we did our podcasts on St. Teresa, she kept being denounced to the Inquisition, even after her death. The only reason the accusation ceased was that she was beatified in 1619. The Inquisition kept receiving accusations until then, but it did nothing with them. It just sat on it. But it just goes to show you that reforming a religious order, in the case of St. John and St. Teresa, you're stepping on the toes of the people who are in charge in the here and now. You're saying what you're doing is wrong and it has to change. And would you add mystical experiences or claims of mystical experiences to it, you're going to get into double trouble, for sure.
I certainly remember from our two-part episode we did on St. Teresa of Avila that the Inquisition was very interested in her and her connections to the alumbrados and her visions, because she was seeing things that the Pope wasn't seeing.
Well, that's the main issue, is you've got this hierarchy in the church, and most of these men, they're not mystics. And many of them in this time period had their positions because of family connections, not because of real vocation. So you've got this very stark contrast between these monks and nuns, or friars and nuns, who are claiming to have these experiences. And of course, it makes them seem like more of the genuine article than anyone who's in charge. And that is why you can end up in a very small cell being subjected to brutality by members of your own religious order for months. There are so many other examples that we could focus on of mystics who spent time in prison. And actually one in particular that we have not talked about, and maybe we could devote an entire podcast to her in the future, is a French mystic, Jane Guyon, better known as Madame Guyon, who lived in the 17th and into the early 18th century, who actually spent time in the Bastille prison in France, in Paris, for saying things that were very similar to the passages that we've been quoting from Meister Eckhart and Marguerite Porete, Julian of Norwich, and so on. She wrote a book with the title A Short and Easy Method of Prayer, which became very controversial because she was talking about the soul being very passive. And I quote, "The soul should abandon itself entirely to God without resistance, without choice, without reflection. And also, the soul is to be annihilated and lost in God like a drop of water in the ocean." Oh, Madame Guyon ended up spending some time in prison, in various different prisons, but including the best-known prison in all of France, the Bastille in Paris. And by her day, a new heresy had been identified, which was given the name quietism. And this passivity, the soul being very passive and so on, is the very essence of the so-called quietist heresy. The soul which has truly abandoned itself to God is indifferent to its own salvation. It's a quote from Madame Guyon. The soul that is united with God no longer needs outward means. What does that mean? It means it doesn't need the charge. So it was interpreted. And that's one of the things that got her in trouble. And another quote, the soul in the state of pure love no longer commits sin. So Madame Guyon has never fully acquired the kind of legitimacy in the Catholic mystical tradition as, let's say, St. Teresa or St. John of the Cross or even Julian of Norwich. But she did have profound influence on the development of Quakerism. The Quakers are in the Protestant family tree, which brings us to the question of the mystical strain in the Protestant tradition. And there is a quite strong mystical strain in the Protestant tradition. But these individuals who were part of this mystical strain could easily get in trouble with the Protestant reformers who didn't like them very much, precisely for the same reasons that, the Catholic hierarchy could not like mystics who claimed to have closeness to God. They were challenging authority, and some of them challenged it very, very, very profoundly. And Luther, for instance, had no patience for anyone who claimed mystical experiences. And there are many people around him who challenged him and actually questioned his authority. Men like Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer was very, very well read in late medieval mystical literature and spoke like a mystic. But I think of anyone that we could talk about today who got into trouble, no one is more extreme than Thomas Müntzer, who claimed that the only people who should be running the church and society were mystics. No one could be a genuine pastor, he said. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting exactly, but no one could be a true pastor who had not had a close experience of God. But Müntzer went even further, joining the Peasants' Revolt, 1525, and being convinced that the end of the world was near, and that the only way that Jesus was going to return is if the godly, that is, and who were the godly? The people who had mystical experiences. And who could that be? Well, no one had better access to God than the downtrodden. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. The Peasants' Rebellion was supposed to bring on the apocalypse. And Luther had so many different insults for Münzer, and Münzer had so many different insults for Luther that it's hard to read them without laughing. With 5 centuries in between, it was not funny in the 16th century. But Luther called Münzer and others like him who were mystically inclined, the German word was Schwärmer, which means crazy people, fanatics, nuts. They were just insane, and they were not to be listened to. So pretty much the same thing happens with anyone who comes along in the 16th and 17th century in the Protestant tradition who focuses on mystical experiences, including one man who actually had to keep moving to escape persecution. Münzer, by the way, ends up being killed in battle during the Peasants' War. He actually dies fighting for the apocalypse. But this other member of the Protestant family tree, Sebastian Franck, kept moving to escape persecution and succeeded in escaping execution. But Sebastian Franck went to the extreme of saying that the Bible was not necessary. Now, how far can you get from the core principle of Protestant Reformation, Scripture alone, sola scriptura, and to say the Bible is the paper pope? That's what he called the Bible. What really mattered was personal experience of the divine. And Sebastian Franck went on to also claim, you don't need a church. You don't need sacraments. All you need is to have a one-on-one connection with God, which is really possible and achievable by everyone. And he is the most extreme example, I think, that can be brought up of quote-unquote dangerous mysticism. And I mean dangerous from the perspective of people who run the church. But he managed to survive and escape ultimate punishment. But when George Fox comes along in England, who's the founder of the Quakers, why are they called Quakers? George Fox and his followers were known as Quakers. This is a derogatory term because they would sometimes go into convulsions with their mystical experiences. They would quake. And Fox and the early Quakers in England underwent tremendous and sometimes horrific persecution at the hands of whom? The established Church of England, because they were such a challenge to the Church of England, which is why so many Quakers crossed the Atlantic Ocean, came to North America, and established themselves here, especially initially in what is now the state of Pennsylvania, because Quakers had very simple approach to worship and similar to Frank's, right? Well, yeah, you had a church and you had rituals, very simple rituals where people simply waited for the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to speak through them. And at a Quaker meeting, as their services were called, a meeting, those present would wait for inspiration from the Spirit to speak. In a way, it's a similarity there and a connection with, Pentecostalism in the Protestant tradition. The whole idea that the Holy Spirit can speak through even the most ordinary person. So sometimes in Quaker services, even to this day, there's a lot of silence as people wait for the Spirit to speak through them. But the life of George Fox, founder of the Quakers, and the lives of some of the early Quakers, filled with persecution and abuse, which is what can happen to those who claim that they have a direct connection to the divine.
Well, I think as we mentioned when we started the show, just the fact that these mystics are having these divine experiences and they're getting at, maybe this is not the correct term, but something along the lines of divine revelation or divine words or messages, better said. It's very easy to see how it could be considered a threat to church leadership, the church hierarchy, the church itself. especially when you consider that a lot of the stuff that they're saying, or some of the stuff that they're saying, is not exactly fall in line with what is being taught, what is in the catechism, or what is in the official teachings of the Protestant Reformation. So persecution naturally follows when you have individuals like this, especially when they have followings.
Yes, and the more followers they get, the more trouble that comes their way. The more successful they are, the more dangerous they become. And there's no mystery behind this. It's very clear to see what's going on, which brings us back to the very basic fact that every mystic who makes their experiences known or public or speaks about them risks trouble from those who are in authority. And the same is true from century to century to century. What makes the history of this somewhat uneven is that for the first millennium, most mystics are not broadcasting their experiences. And then in the Middle Ages, when writing becomes more common and texts appear and so on, you have a higher number of individuals who get into trouble. And then comes the Reformation period and the Catholic Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, lots of mystical stuff going on and lots of challenges, lots of pushback. And then you get to the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century, and you have fewer challenges, fewer individuals being questioned, processed, disciplined. And in the 20th century, Padre Pio could not escape all of this either. He went through some rough times. And in his case, as in the case of St. Teresa and many other of these early modern mystics, including Joseph of Cupertino, the issue was the spiritual gifts that they received. In the case of Teresa and Joseph of Cupertino, it was their levitations. In the case of Padre Pio, it was the stigmata, which were questioned. Imagine, in the 20th century, somebody claiming that they have the wounds of Christ. Oh, things got so tough for Padre Pio for a while that he was forbidden to hear confessions, because the number of people flocking to him for confession was immense. And all sorts of charges were made against him that, for instance, his stigmata were self-inflicted. And someone dug up a prescription for Padre Pio that he had obtained for carbolic acid. And the charge was made that he used this carbolic acid to give himself the stigmata. He tried to defend himself as ably as he could. And eventually, obviously, he was eventually canonized saint by the Catholic Church, which means none of this was considered to be true, that he was inflicting these wounds on himself. But carbolic acid was a way of treating wounds in the early part of the 20th century. And he claimed that he had that prescription for carbolic acid because he was taking care of people who were wounded. So any outlandish claim of anything that is abnormal, anomalous, such as stigmata or levitation, can also get a mystic into trouble.
One can say the big takeaway from this episode is, for all the upside that being a mystic can have, the experiences, the visions, the understanding, it also has its downsides.
It's inevitable. Inevitable. And in the 21st century, as in the 20th century, you're not only going to get into trouble within the religious framework, whatever your church is, but you're also going to attract a lot of criticism from outside of the religious sphere, from doubters and skeptics who will just say that you're, total fraud or insane or completely deluded.
That is unavoidable, especially in this day and age. But this has been a very insightful episode, learning about the downside to mysticism and how these mystics have suffered persecution and trials and all the issues they've gone through because of this gift that they received from God. And one of those mystics that we discussed Madame Jean Guyon, I think would be a good subject for our next episode.
Yeah, she straddles various boundaries, and has had an influence within the Catholic tradition as well as the Protestant tradition. So she is one of these mystics who challenges traditional boundaries in more than one way.
Well, I can't wait to hear all about her. Thank you, Carlos, for another great episode. I want to wish you a very happy Easter. I want to wish all our listeners a very happy Easter. And thank you for supporting us. Thank you for the emails. We really do appreciate your feedback and your questions. And until the next time, thank you for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.